770 million consumers. That's a market we should be aiming to conquer. With these words, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen promoted the Mercosur free trade agreement with Latin American countries on Thursday. The harsh and aggressive tone shows how far the Commission has shifted to the right and how much pressure it is under to legitimize itself, coupled with the enormous economic challenges facing companies in the European Union. In her speech to leading business representatives in Berlin, von der Leyen spoke about global trade, competitiveness, and defense. In the run up to the speech, the four major German business associations published a list of demands which they were able to discuss directly with the Commission President. The background to this discussion is an anniversary. A year ago, the much discussed Draghi report on competitiveness of the European Union was published. I will take a closer look at this today, and to this end, I have examined the report presented by the Commission on Tuesday, as well as listened to what Mario Draghi himself had to say, the author of the report and former president of the European Central Bank and economics professor. And while hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets again today in France to protest against the government's austerity plans, European trade unions also spoke out with a critical paper on the Commission's plans. With that, welcome to today's episode of On Your Left, the news brief that looks behind the headlines on economic developments, politics, and trade union issues in and around Europe. My name is Felix Sassmannshaus. Conquering markets, breaking down barriers, and making life easier for businesses. That is the program of the current EU Commission, financed with billions in loans and investments. The focus is on Europe's competitiveness, the Commission's central keyword. A year ago, the highly acclaimed Draghi report was published, and now the Commission has taken stock. Von der Leyen emphasized that competitiveness means jobs, good wages, and profits. In short, our European way of life, as she stated. She recalled that Draghi intended his report to be a roadmap for action, not a purely academic treatise. And that is why the Commission launched a competitiveness compass to translate the report into practical policy. In her speech, von der Leyen took up the three pillars of the Draghi report and highlighted the Commission's achievements in each area. First, catching up on innovation. Second, advancing decarbonization and competitiveness. Thirdly, reducing dependencies on technology, energy, and raw materials. She cited numerous initiatives as successes during her term in office so far. The Clean Industrial Deal, for example, the construction of AI gigafactories all across Europe, and the new framework for state aid and an action plan for affordable energy. According to the Commission, over €1 trillion has been mobilized, and more than half of the initiatives have already been implemented. A success story, one might think. However, Mario Draghi himself did not paint such a rosy picture and struck a much more critical note. He welcomed the Commission's focus on competitiveness and emphasized that he approves of many of the approaches, but he also expressed understanding for the growing frustration of citizens and businesses over the slow pace of implementation of the plans. Von der Leyen herself admitted that none of the 6 omnibus procedures for reducing bureaucratic hurdles in the EU has been implemented yet. She pointed out that it was now up to the Parliament and to the EU member states to take action. Draghi called the slow progress complacency and warned business as usual means decline. His key findings: the challenges have not been resolved since the publication of his report, but have even intensified. The European growth model is under pressure, for example, due to the crisis in the automotive and steel industries. Global trade and high-value exports continue to decline. He referred to the high US tariffs, and he addressed the growing competition from China, whose trade surplus with the EU has even risen by almost 20% since his report was published. Europe's dependence on the US for defense and on China for critical materials limits its room for maneuver. And that threatens its resilience, Draghi explains. Without faster growth, climate, digital, and security targets are at risk of being missed, and Financing aging societies will become impossible, he says. At the same time, financing needs are rising enormously. The European Central Bank estimates the investment needs for 2025 to 2031 at almost 1.2 trillion euros, significantly more than a year ago. And the share required from the public sector has doubled, mainly due to massive increases in defense spending. Despite optimistic forecasts, EU government debt is expected to rise to 93% of GDP over the next decade. Europe is in a more difficult position today, Draghi concluded. He named three areas that need more ambition. First, technology. Europe is lagging behind in large AI foundation models, he criticizes. He calls for a 28th regime, that is, a uniform European legal framework that would enable companies to grow and obtain financing seamlessly in all member states. Research funding should be focused more on programs and centers of excellence, and the general data protection regulation should be radically simplified, he demands. This mainly concerns reporting requirements for small and medium sized enterprises. The second area he mentioned was decarbonization and energy production. Gas prices in the EU are almost 4 times higher than in the US, he said, and industrial electricity prices are more than twice as high. This gap jeopardizes the transition to a high tech economy, so he calls for faster investment in grids, interconnections, and in clean baseload capacities such as nuclear energy. Energy projects across the EU should be better coordinated, for example, through joint gas purchasing, he says. The third area is economic security and industrial policy. The boundary between the economy and security is becoming blurred, explains the former central banker. Europe must build up capacity to defend itself and withstand bottlenecks, for example, in defense, heavy industry, and future technologies. To this end, he proposes various levers: the coordination of state aid instead of protectionism, for example, via important projects of common European interest. Secondly, public contracts should be awarded specifically to European industry in order to create stable demand. And lastly, there should be competition promotion in defense and space through market consolidation, he claims, in order to accelerate innovation. The most important thing, according to Draghi, is not just to draft strategies, but to present concrete data and results. Europe must act more like a federal state in some areas, including joint debt for joint projects. Draghi's assessment of the Commission is therefore quite critical. And also, the German trade associations see a massive need for action. They published a joint statement on the occasion of a summit meeting with von der Leyen in Berlin on Thursday. Their diagnosis coincides in part with that of the Commission and of Draghi. For them, regaining economic strength is a top priority, especially regarding the ongoing slump in the German economy. An economically weak Europe is less able to assert its interests and its values, they claim. The associations support the Commission in measures that promote this goal. Their 5 core demands are: they want to accelerate the reduction of bureaucracy. Secondly, energy should be made more affordable and secure through rapid grid expansion and technological openness, including nuclear power and fewer CO2 restrictions, as is also currently being pushed for in Germany by Economics Minister Katharina Reiche from the CDU. The internal market is thirdly to be strengthened. Trades in goods and services should be simplified and standardized in order to promote intra-European exports, a particular priority for German companies that now face difficulties regarding China and the United States. Fourthly, there is to be a particular focus on relieving the burden on small and medium-sized enterprises, they demand. And finally, the aim is to open up global markets and strengthen supply chain resilience. This means the rapid conclusion of new trade agreements, particularly with Latin America, so Mercosur, with India, Australia, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And that brings us back to von der Leyen's announcement that she wants to conquer the Latin American market, the centerpiece of the free trade agenda in response to the aggressive trade and export policies of China and the United States. Criticism of this policy comes from the left and from trade unions such as the European Trade Union Confederation. Secretary General Esther Lynch rejects the race to the bottom in competition with global rivals such as the United States and China. For her, deregulation is not the solution, as she calls the Commission's reduction of bureaucracy, a criticism that has been echoed by over 470 civil society organizations. According to them, the dismantling of protective measures makes Europe more fragile rather than stronger. Instead, investment should flow into the skills of wage earners. Deregulation undermines productivity, they say, erodes skills, and makes employees and companies vulnerable, Lynch said. Some companies use competitive measures as an excuse to dismantle the European social model. But according to Lynch, it is precisely this model that is the basis for stability, trust, and competitiveness. The European Trade Union Confederation lists three key initiatives that it is putting forward in opposition to the Commission's plans. Firstly, the demand for a Just Transition Act, so employees should have the right to further training. Second, a Quality Jobs Act. This should include secure jobs and fair conditions, as well as an increase in the collective bargaining coverage to 80%. In many EU countries, such as Germany, this has been in decline for years. Lynch calls, thirdly, for a European investment pact for productivity. This should be negotiated jointly with trade unions to ensure that productivity gains also benefit employees. Lynch emphasizes the importance of strong public services in education, housing, health, childcare, and transport, particularly in view of high public debt and rising military spending. She rejects short-term austerity plans that undermine these social foundations, probably with an eye to the ongoing protests in France. So, to summarize and put this into context, while Commission President von der Leyen praises her work in line with the competitiveness report, Mario Draghi warns against lethargy and calls for radical steps from state aid to joint debt and faster decision making. And the pressure from business associations is enormous. They are calling for rapid bureaucracy reduction, new sales markets, and, in some cases, setbacks in climate protection when it comes to energy or cars, for example. The trade unions, on the other hand, warn that competitiveness must not come at the expense of the social model, but must invest in people and high quality jobs. These positions are currently irreconcilable. An increasingly crisis ridden capitalism demands rapid action for level competition. The Commission is responding with deregulation, industrial policy, billions in loans and subsidies. Where these funds are invested, however, they are lacking elsewhere, resulting in cuts to social services, for example, in Germany or France. And these tensions are likely to increase in the coming months. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to stay informed, you can subscribe to my newsletter, which is published every Tuesday. And I also welcome Steady or Substack subscriptions. Until next time.